Welcome to the PFF Fantasy Football Podcast. I am your host, Ian Hartitz, and today we are continuing our team preview series with the Detroit Lions. I've already gone through the AFC North. This will be the final episode of our NFC North portion. We'll get on to the AFC East as we continue to go through every single NFL team prior to Week 1 of the 2020 season. So, without further ado, your fantasy football preview for the 2020 Detroit Lions. Starting off with Matthew Stafford. I think people are underestimating just how good he and the entire Lions offense were in 2019, how good they can be again in 2020. And particularly from a fantasy perspective, I mean, this was just absurd. Only Lamar Jackson, Deshaun Watson, and Dak Prescott averaged more fantasy points per game than Stafford last season. I mean, what this guy was doing week in and week out was ballsy, and it was efficient, and it was awesome. I mean, he led all QBs in average target depth, deep ball rate, tight window throws. I mean, it was fantastic. The guy was being, a complete gunslinger, finally using that cannon he has for a right arm for good. I mean, how many years do we have to watch Stafford, just kind of dink and dunk the ball to Theo Riddick and Golden Tate within 10 yards of the line of scrimmage all game? Darrell Bevell comes in year one. All of a sudden, Kenny Golladay, Marvin Jones getting all sorts of fantasy-friendly targets downfield, and Stafford made the most of it, hitting Marvin Hall for, a deep shot every game. Just awesome play from Stafford all season long. The broken back, not good. Any 30-year-old coming off a back injury, it's not good. And, Stafford is 32. It's not like he just turned 30 or anything like that. He's been around the block, but I don't know. We've seen, I was looking at kind of fantasy quarterbacks and when we see their most productive seasons, and honestly there's more quarterbacks in their 10 plus year in the league that have been top 12 PPR performers compared to any other age experience. So I know part of that is going to be a bigger pool of quarterbacks with years of experience between 10 and however many years Brady and Breeze have been in the league. But we don't need to assume necessarily these days that a quarterback, just because they are, creeping up to their 30s now, is all of a sudden not going to be, a relevant fantasy asset. So I'm loving Matt Stafford to get back to what he was doing last season again in 2020. Only Lamar Jackson and Russell Wilson really ahead of the guy in the MVP conversation before he got hurt to begin with. So do not sleep on what Stafford could do with 16 full games in 2020, because I don't think they're going to be running the ball all that much in 2020. They got DeAndre Swift, drafting them real high. Way too, second round pick. You don't draft second round picks and not give them double digit touches early on. But the problem is, Kerryon Johnson isn't going to go anywhere unless he gets hurt again. And they love Kerryon. It's unfortunate that in back-to-back seasons, when they finally felt good enough about the guy to give him a 3-down role, he suffers an IR worthy injury almost immediately in both. I mean, he's so fun to watch, but it's just tough. If this is Swift and Kerryon, if it's a two-back committee, they're going, 50-50 or 60-40 or something like that, that's fine. We can live with that as fantasy investors. There are so few one-back backfields in this league anyway. If we can get it down to just two, that's fine. I don't know, though. The last couple weeks of last season, once Kerryon came back, it was Kerryon, it was Bo Scarborough, it was Ty Johnson, even J.D. McKissick. All these guys were getting between 10 and 45% of the snaps. I mean, Ty Johnson, just throughout the season, from week 1 on, was getting, this kind of 20-30% snap roll. So it's just one of these situations where Patricia, we know he's a committee back guy. I don't think there's any reason to believe that either Swift or Kerryon with health are going to overtake the other just based on, both of their status as good players. Swift is going to be the more fantasy-friendly back because I think he's got that pass down work, accounted for. But this isn't an offense that's going to be checking the ball now as much as we got used to seeing. So Swift is the only running back here that we should be expecting, maybe RB2 value from, but I'm generally staying away. Again, hopefully this is a two-back backfield, but sneaky chance for it to be 3 or, God forbid, even 4 backs. So moving on, the wide receiver room. So with Stafford last season, in those 8 games, Kenny Golladay had 62 targets, Marvin Jones had 57 targets, Danny Amendola 44 in just 7 games, TJ Hockenson in number 4 spot with 38 targets. And, in those 8 games, Golladay was the league's PPR wide receiver 11, Marvin Jones the wide receiver 14. I mean, Marvin Jones is just underrated in every single season. If you're a fantasy analyst and you're not talking about how much value he has, I mean, what are you doing out here? It's just year in and year out. But that doesn't mean it's kind of like Pittsburgh, where we're all talking about TJ Johnson being this value. Just because the wide receiver 2 is a value doesn't mean the wide receiver 1 can't also be a value. I mean, both of these guys last season were top 15 wide receivers in terms of fantasy-friendly targets. And what I mean by that is I went through every receiver in the league, and if you look back historically, receivers average more fantasy points per target on deep balls and on red zone targets compared to, intermediate targets between the 20s. This makes sense. You're either picking up lots of yards on a deep ball or you're hopefully finding the end zone if you're getting those looks in the red zone. And again, both Golladay and Marvin, top 15 among over 70 qualified wide receivers just in fantasy-friendly target rate. With Stafford back, with Pavel back, there's just no reason to really expect that to fall off. Now, I think we see a blow-up from Golladay in the near future, could even be in 2020. People talk about he doesn't have his separation ability. Be careful about knocking wide receivers on separation, because I don't think we have the best stats for that yet. I mean, all the credit in the world to NFL's next gen stats. They do a lot of cool things, but when your separation stat says that Jimmy Graham is the best in the league at separating, probably time to rework the stat, or at a minimum we shouldn't be talking about that stat as something to denote who's good at separating from defenders and who's not. So Kenny Golladay, again, call him Babytron for a reason. If this dude can get 150 targets in a season, look out. That could be coming in 2020. Marvin hasn't been able to, finish these seasons recently. But again, it's one of these situations where we don't have to buy Marvin as a wide receiver 2, expecting that value. He's still going that wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4 range. Way too cheap to not consider taking a shot on at that point in the draft. Moving on to the tight end room, I mentioned before, again, Hockenson with Stafford under center was number 4 in this offense by targets, and it wasn't all that close. I mean, to be 6 targets behind Amendola, even with the full benefit of an extra game, not great. And it's just the Hockenson talent is out of this world. I mean, I was talking to, podfather Matt Kelly on a PFF pod where we went over all the tight ends, and he's just incredibly high on Hockenson, buying the talent. He's saying, look, we saw the blow-up game in week 1 against the Cardinals. Targets weren't there. Could definitely take over Amendola and just year 2 tight ends in general, because I've mentioned this in other pods, but we don't see rookie tight ends do anything. Only Evan Ingram, and who needed an OBJ injury to only play 4 games that year, and Rob Gronkowski have been top 12 fantasy performers at the tight end position as rookies since 2010. So the fact Hockenson did anything last year, even if it was pretty much one big performance against the worst tight end defense we've ever seen, the fact he did anything is great news for him moving forward. There's just a little too much concern for me to be too high on him this year. The targets, just it's tough to say they're going to be there. When he was 4th last year and the same crew's back, maybe he gets up to 3rd. Even then, there's still other tight ends we can target around the league that are talented and have a chance to be their offense's number 2 or even number 1 target. And that floor is very low for Hockenson. I mean, he only cleared 50 yards twice all of last season. He's coming off a very serious ankle injury. And I saw some off-season videos of him and Kittle working out, and they both look like, beastly all-world tight ends that they're, both were drafted and coming up to be. So it seems like he's fine, but, a few injury questions, and not to mention that we have Sheriff Jesse James just low-key stealing 20-30% of the snaps every week. For some reason, last offseason, the Lions gave James a $20 million plus contract. He's not going anywhere. He's still there. Unfortunately, I don't know if Hockenson is even going to have this every snap role that he absolutely deserves. He's really good. I don't hate betting on the talent, as in that teen range, in the tight end 2 range, you're 15, 16, whatever it might be, but I just think a lot of people have him going earlier. I am not going to be chasing Hockenson as a top 10 tight end in 2020. So moving on to the rankings, you can find these as always on PFF.com. Use code FANTASY40 for 40% off my rankings and all other sorts of cool stuff from the fine folks at Pro Football Focus. I'm going to list my rankings for these players and then who I have both in front and behind them. At quarterback, I have Matthew Stafford, QB 10. And, I'm taking them ahead of Tom Brady and right behind Drew Brees. I just think, I'm selling some of that Tampa hype a little bit. And Stafford, to be fourth in fantasy points per game last season and to not even really have an ADP more than that QB1 borderline, sign me up, people. At running back, I have DeAndre Swift, as my RB30, one spot behind Darius Geis, one spot ahead of J.K. Dobbins. Again, I mean, that 2 RB potential is there. I'm a little worried they're going to do it, and I just don't think there's really any circumstance where we see Swift just take over that backfield unless we see multiple injuries happen. Kerryon, a little bit lower on than the rest of the industry. I have him as my RB50. He could absolutely outperform this, but I think kind of similar to Swift, the fact that there just isn't that high ceiling causing me to be, this low on him. I have Kerryon one spot ahead of Darrington Evans from Tennessee and one spot behind the Bills' new rookie, Zach Moss. At wide receiver, I have Kenny Golladay as my wide receiver 8, one spot ahead of A.J. Brown, one spot behind Allen Robinson. Just think that the things he can do on this field, if he can get 150 plus targets, I mean, we're talking about a true chance to be the league's wide receiver 1. With or without Marvin, you just can't guard this dude. Marvin Jones is my wide receiver 33. I have him one spot behind Michael Gallup, one spot ahead of Hollywood Brown. I like all these guys in this range. I mean, we've talked about this where the reason why so many people are going running back early in drafts is because you can literally talk yourself into the top 40, even 50 wide receivers one way or another in terms of being, these kind of high end to at a minimum, very relevant fantasy options throughout the season. And then at tight end, I do have TJ Hockenson as my tight end 15, one spot ahead of Jonnu Smith, one spot behind Chris Herndon. I don't mind betting on the talent right there. I mean, again, these are rankings, so if he's there as your tight end 15, absolutely, but what I've seen with the ADP so far, not a guy I'm really willing to chase. So moving on, win total 6.5. Now I've taken the under on the Packers, Vikings, and Bears. I think the NFC North is down this year. With the Vikings and Bears, it's a situation where, their teams weren't bad last year. In the Vikings case, they were really good, but they both lost some pieces, and I don't think what they brought in is going to outweigh that by any stretch. The Packers were a 500 team by most efficiency statistics last year. Rodgers helped carry them to a 9-1 record in one-score games. We just don't see that sort of performance usually persist season to season. And the Lions, you want to talk about unlucky teams from last year. I mean, they were 3-4-1 with Stafford under center. That included just a wild Chiefs game that, had fumbles at the goal line that were being taken back the distance and, just back and forth down the wire. Easily could have been a win for him there. And then just a Packers game that was a robbery. The league could have even intervened and done something with that. So I realize with, hindsight being 2020, we can go back and kind of pick apart a lot of these teams' final records. But just realize that this team, when Stafford was healthy, they were right there with anyone else in this division in terms of being the best squad out there. So I'm taking over 6.5 wins. I talked about this with Evan Silva on the first PFF Fantasy Football podcast I did. I even like the Lions to win the division this year, people, especially with those odds. The difference between them and the best team in their division is arguably, thinner than any other disparity between the first and fourth projected team in any division across the league. So I love the chance for the Lions to make a lot of noise this year. I understand the Matt Patricia concerns. I understand that, the Lions concerns. The defense likely won't be all that great. Just kind of threw a bunch of, crap at the wall. We got maybe Okudah steps in and just is Darius Slay-esque from day one. Maybe all those Patriots defenders they brought in can help give them, a poor man's version of that unit. But, I'm thinking just a little bit of regression there in a weak division with a loaded offense. I am buying the Lions passing game and the Lions as a whole in 2020. Thank you all for listening. This has been the PFF Fantasy Football Podcast. I'm your host, Ian Hartitz. Take care, everyone.